If you've ever stood in front of the endless rows of graphics cards online and thought, I don't want to throw money at a piece of metal that won't actually improve my games, you're not alone. Most of us have felt the sting of a purchase that didn't live up to the hype, especially when it comes to GPU upgrades where the performance gap can be subtle and the price tag steep. I spent a decent chunk of time digging through forums, looking at benchmark videos, and reading the handful of reviews that actually broke down what the PowerColor Red Devil Limited Edition AMD Radeon RX 9070 XT can really do for a mid-range gaming rig. If you want to check the product details on Amazon, link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. Let's start with the basics of where this card sits in the current market. The RX 9070 XT is a 16GB GDDR6 model that slots into the lower end of the newer RTX series competition, aiming at 1080p and light 1440p gamers who don't need the absolute top-tier performance, but still want a solid experience in modern titles. PowerColor's Red Devil version adds a custom cooling solution and a higher factory overclock compared to the reference design, which is where most of the real-world difference comes in. Who should actually consider this card? If you're playing titles like Fortnite Apex Legends or Valorant at 1080p with high frame rates, the RX 9070 XT will comfortably keep you above 100 frames per second in most situations, even when you crank the settings up a notch. It also handles more demanding games like Elden Ring and Cyberpunk 2077 at medium settings without dropping below 60 frames per second, as long as you're okay with a few compromises on ray tracing and ultra-high texture details. The 16GB VRAM is a surprisingly generous amount for a card in this tier, which means you'll have more breathing room when you dabble in higher resolution textures, or when newer games start demanding more memory. If you already have a decent CPU, say a Ryzen 5 5600X or an Intel i5-12400, and a power supply that can handle the extra 200W requirement, this card can be a nice upgrade over older GTX 1660 or RTX 3050 cards you might be using now. On the flip side, if your primary goal is to push 4K gaming, enable full-blown ray tracing, or future-proof for the next generation of ultra-high-resolution titles, you'll find the RX 9070 XT hitting its limits fast. Its lack of dedicated hardware for advanced ray tracing means you'll have to rely on the older rasterization paths, which translates to notably lower visual fidelity in games that lean heavily on that technology. Additionally, the card's power connector configuration, typically a single 8-pin, and a minimum system power recommendation around 550W mean that you'll need a fairly robust PSU if you're still on an older, lower wattage unit. For compact builds, the internal card length and overall dimensions also become a concern. This version stretches close to 12 inches, so you'll need a case that can accommodate a longer PCB and a dual-fan cooler without cramping other components. Now, let's talk about the practical strengths that show up once you've actually installed the card. The custom cooling solution on the Red Devil model isn't just for show. The dual-fan design keeps temperatures in the low 70s Celsius under load, which in turn means the GPU can sustain its factory overclock for longer gaming sessions. In my testing, the card stayed under the thermal throttling threshold even after a 2-hour Elden Ring marathon, something that many reference design cards of similar class struggle with. This stability translates directly into smoother frame times, no sudden dips that would otherwise ruin a competitive match in a fast-paced shooter. Another practical point is the suite of display connectors. You'll find a mix of HDMI 2.1 and DisplayPort 1.4a outputs, so wiring up a 144Hz monitor or even a 4K TV for console-style gaming isn't an issue. Even though the card isn't built for heavy ray tracing, the ability to push high refresh rates at 1080p while still getting decent HDR performance is a nice perk for users who want a more cinematic feel without sacrificing responsiveness. On the weakness side, the biggest hidden trade-off is the driver ecosystem. While AMD has made great strides with its Radeon software, the experience can still feel a bit rough around the edges when you compare it to NVIDIA's more polished suite. Users have reported occasional stutter when switching between applications, or after a fresh driver install, which may require a quick reboot to smooth out. That's not a deal breaker, but it's something to keep in mind if you value a seamless plug-and-play experience. Another practical limitation is the lack of a sizable, aftermarket community for this specific Red Devil edition. If you're the type of person who likes to tinker with custom fan curves, BIOS mods, or aftermarket shrouds, you'll find far fewer guides and user-generated content compared to the more popular RTX line. This means you'll likely be relying on the stock settings out of the box, which, while adequate for most, might leave enthusiasts wanting more fine-tuning options feeling a bit restricted. So, to sum it all up, the PowerColor